Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Chagnon, and I'm curator at the Aga Khan Museum. I'm pleased to welcome you this afternoon as we hear from Ekow Nimako, who will be discussing the inspiration behind the stunning artworks featured in his exhibition, Building Black Civilizations, currently on view in our galleries. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge this land on which the Aga Khan Museum stands, known as the Takaronto, and honor the stewardship, past, present, and future, of the Huron-Wendat, the Iroquois Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. During this afternoon artist dialogue, sculptor Ekow Nimako will answer questions and explore the complex themes of his current exhibition, Building Black Civilizations, on view in our galleries through February and running concurrently with the exhibition Caravans of Gold. The son of Ghanaian immigrants, Ekow was drawn to West African symbolism and obsessive play with the innovative and iconic Lego building system from a very young age. Later experiences as a racialized person led to his awareness around Black identity, as well as the importance of multidimensional representation, and Afrofuturism as a vehicle for Black liberation, connecting past, present, and future. From the vast medieval kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa and their tremendous global impact, to the modern cultural utopia of Wakanda, the content of Ekow's work is deeply rooted in otherworldly Black narratives, architecture, futuristic cultures, and ancient civilizations. Ekow studied fine arts at York University and began using Lego pieces exclusively in his practice in 2014. His unparalleled practice reveals a master's attention to fluidity and form and an ingenious synthesis of concept and material expression. It's my pleasure and deep honor to welcome Ekow Nimako to the stage.
Check, check. Thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate it. My name is Ekow Nimako, as I'm sure you know by now. And my exhibit is called Building Black Civilizations, and which is a part of a larger body of work that is just entitled Building Black, which I've delved into various iterations of with Building Black Mythos, which explores mythology using more figurative sculptures, and what will be coming up in the new year, Building Black Amorphia, which focuses on the merging different forms and visages drawn from African and mask and masquerade traditions, as well as different animal forms. But this exhibition, Building Black Civilizations, and this is the first time that I've done it with so much gratitude towards the Aga Khan Museum for bringing me here and allowing me to be expressive and to really, share my art with the world. So I figure I would start with a short documentary which will give you some more context around my career and the choices that I've made and why I've made those choices and the different types of things that I do. So I'll let the documentary play and then we'll commence with the lecture. I'm at my daughter's baby shower. Everyone's having a good time. All of a sudden, someone's calling out, "Come outside, everyone come outside, hands up." I ended up in the back seat of a police car with two of my best friends and my 3-year-old daughter. It was just a total disaster. There was no guns, there was no weapon at all, but this trauma has been inflicted on this one family. You know, you carry those things, so this all kind of fuels what I do. As the great poet Biggie Smalls said, there's rules to this shit. And there are rules to this shit, this Lego shit. I like to play by the rules
but bend them a little bit sometimes too. You know, you hear that snap. Something is fitting into something else in the way that they designed it to fit. The Lego informs the art, you know? You can see something and think it's marvelous, but you'll have to think about why it's that way. You know, why is it he's building in black all the time? Then you see me and you're like, okay, I kind of get it. And then you dig even deeper and you'll start to make the connections, right? Oh, wow. Photo references are really important. I'm just trying to get a sense of the animal and the shapes. How do I get that gray to interact with this black and still maintain that curve? How do I achieve that? I'm kind of just conscious of my joints. Not that I plan on getting arthritis, but preventative measures. This is a sculpture of Peele's dolphin. People love sloths. I don't know what the fascination is. Because I have this ability to use the material in a way that is going to be fascinating to people, it gives me a great platform to affect some kind of change. If you have like an identity-based artist coming in and talking to kids about the importance of their identity and everyone else's identity, you have younger people starting to understand that, then you'll develop a sensitivity towards that. When I see Black children engage with my work, to see them look at themselves reflected with something that typically doesn't reflect them, that is like the most profound thing. I read a quote recently, I'm not sure who said it, but being an artist is successful in itself or something to that effect, right? Because it's draining and it's difficult to keep going. Maybe people don't care as much about your work as you think they do or as you do, and it won't go as far as you want it to go. And every single artist feels that at some point. Sometimes I surprise myself. I'm like, how are you doing this? You have so much further to go, and you're still going. So that's fulfilling.
All right. Okay, so civilizations. In my opinion, they're most often defined by architecture and artifacts. But in a more abstract sense, I think they're defined by stories, written odysseys, symbols, hieroglyphics even, complex oral traditions. And these things all tell the tales and stories of the people that made civilizations into what they are or were. The epic tales of Africa in the Middle Ages, whether fictional or historical, do not typically make it into the mainstream or like the collective consciousness. And as a result, this is as a result of the old tradition of racism. My exhibition, Building Black, is a result, or Civilizations, is in many ways a chronicle and simultaneous foretelling of the untold stories and places meant to breathe life and texture into both the Medieval and Futuristic African and Afro-Diasporic Landscape. So this book, The Royal Kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhay, Life in Medieval Africa, was very important to the creation of Building Black Civilizations. I repurchased it on a Kindle just before the exhibition, but I'd actually been given this book several years ago by a friend when I could say that my own understanding of Black consciousness was really developing and I was delving deeper into my own identity. And I got a hold of this book and it was illuminating, in fact, because when I would think of like the medieval era, often, you know, King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table, these are the images that were conjured for me, in opposed to ideas of African kings that were existing in that time, like Mansa Musa, which you can learn about as well with Caravans of Gold, the exhibition that essentially brought me here. So when I was young, there was this book called Tales from Around the World, and my father was instrumental in providing so much of this like imaginative like information for me. So I was always into folk tales and fables, and this one book, it presented stories from around the world, but the challenging part about the book was that it was written by white authors that went around the world and collected stories from different regions, but the stories, when they were passed down, they weren't told directly from the people within their own cultural context. So they were passed through a filter. And despite the fact that I enjoyed the fact that I got access to these stories and illustrations, and they stay with me to this day, when I go back and read these stories, or when I was reading them to my daughters, certain things started to come up in terms of like the language and little inaccuracies that made me reflect a little bit deeper on where this information was coming from, and also made me want to go upstream and find the information directly from the source, as opposed to getting it from a place where I felt it got a little bit more muddy. So, there's a king called Sundiata Keita that had like so many different exploits and was revered as this king of the Malayan Empire in the Middle Ages, but they're not the kind of characters that get mythologized and brought into like our minds. So it was this whole experience of building sculptures, using material that were drawn from my childhood, using things that stayed with me from my childhood, but then also giving me a platform to explore deeper into these same themes, was an amazing experience, and an experience that was full of different kinds of discoveries and revelations. And it made me also reflect on, like, I can only dream of how it would have changed my perspective, and not only my perspective, but the perspective of other Black children who were eager to see heroes and characters that looked like us, even if we didn't recognize that we were eager to see these kind of characters when we were consuming the things that were meant to inspire us. And for me, actually, in many ways, did inspire me, despite the fact that I didn't see myself in a lot of the stories. So, let's see. All right, so this map was also important for me just because it showed me where the Kingdom of Ghana actually existed, which was here, right? And very different from, or displaced from, modern day Ghana. And in that process, I also learned that Ghana itself was named Ghana in the 50s when they gained independence from the British. And they took the name Ghana, which means warrior king, from the medieval empire of Ghana, which was some leagues away. And they still, like, it, for me, that was kind of like, it became a tradition in a way, because if you've all seen my sculpture, Kumbi Saleh 3020 CE, I did the same thing with that sculpture where I imagined a futuristic city, but gave it the name of a medieval city that was in the medieval empire of Ghana. So I felt a lot more connected in that way because it was almost like carrying on this tradition of taking something from the past and giving it life in the future. All right, so the world's oldest university, University of Sankore in Timbuktu, Mali. So I don't know if you all, from this image alone, can see some of like the resemblances, if you all got a chance to see the city Kumbi Saleh that I built. And it's funny because I actually didn't see this image until I was putting together this presentation long after Kumbi Saleh was actually built. So despite the fact that there's this center spire and even like the layout of this university and collection of dwellings and mosques, it's something about this translated into my work without having even seen it. So it makes me really think that, was there something, deeper and spiritual happening when I was building this sculpture? Because when I tend to build, there's not typically a lot of blueprints and drawings that are done. Sometimes for larger scale pieces, I will draw some things out. But for the most part, I really like to just get my hands into the Lego and start building and allow the Lego to, in many ways, dictate what's going to happen. And that is based on the different kinds of parts that I have available to me at the time, or different ideas that I have and how I find the best ways to create it. So there's a lot of trial and error with my process due to the fact that there's not like a finite blueprint. With Kumbi Saleh, the city, I did draw while I was on a plane. I just decided to like start sketching something out, and it turned out that the sketch that I drew ended up being a pretty good roadmap for the actual city that I built. So yeah, it's interesting in the way that sometimes knowledge and information and inspiration comes from like a different plane where you don't necessarily have to see something and then have it, reflect on it, and then, continue and build and create from that place. Sometimes things just filter into your mind and you don't know. Maybe something you've seen when you were really small, something that just exists in the world and found its way into your heart. And then when it's time for you to create, those things find their way out. Right, so this is a quote from the same book that I'd shown you. While Europe was torn by the 100 Years' War, scholars were writing books in comfort and security at Timbuktu, and artisans were crafting magnificent pieces in copper and gold. And I thought this quote was really important just because it helped to illustrate the fact that, despite the fact that when we think of the medieval era, a lot of focus is on Europe, as if that is the only place that was experiencing, really anything. When in fact, while they were caught in extended turmoil, people were thriving and learning and drawing people from around the world to come and study at this university. And now we come to comics. Are there comic book fans in the audience at all? Yeah, I see some hands going up. Comics were super, super, super important to me growing up. I love comic books. I love comic characters, superheroism, the colors, the illustration. I would say that when I was young, drawing and playing with Lego while watching cartoons were probably the most influential to me becoming an artist. I was never, and even as I got older, I was never much into different art movements, like highbrow art. I'd never really followed those kind of traditions. They never really inspired me much. So when it came to art, everything that I valued came from cartoons and comic books. And I'd say, if I was to say my favorite comic book characters growing up were the X-Men. And what was really interesting to me is that the X-Men it's predicated on them being outcasts, right? They're mutants. They band together because no one else will have them. And, they fight crime, obviously, and they still have this drive to protect the people that oppress them. But what was strange to me is that among these outcasts and people that were shunned from society, there was Storm, who was a brilliant character, super powerful and amazing. And, I was very drawn to this character also because she's from the continent. She's an African woman. And I remember seeing Bishop here and there. And he was, I mean, I didn't really follow this character too much. Somewhat racially ambiguous, but for the most part, I think he looks South Asian. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what his ethnicity was. But nonetheless, he had brown skin, so, you know, I kind of paid attention to Bishop and Storm. But it was always, like, problematic for me that these characters that I cared so much about didn't necessarily reflect me. And even more so strange because the fact that, I mean, like, they're outcasts. So what kind of a world are they creating where, in my opinion, often the most vulnerable people, Black folks, are not even fully represented among the outcasts in this imaginary society. However, I will say that Marvel Comics was really important because despite the fact that there was issues of representation and diversity, they still managed, Stan Lee, rest in peace, to come up with something that I'm sure inspired a lot of people from its inception, but as I'm sure you all know, as of like last year, became a bit of a global phenomenon, which was Black Panther and the idea of Wakanda. And I mean, I'm not sure if you all saw the kind of like response that particularly like Black communities around the world, but I'm sure a lot of people that also non-Black people responded to this movie and this film, and how significant for me it was to bring an Afrofuturistic realm like this into the mainstream with the same kind of backing and support that other films like The Hulk and Captain America received. It was absolutely phenomenal. And the interesting thing about this film, and how much it like inspired me, but the interesting thing to me was that it wasn't, I don't even consider it my favorite film, Marvel film, in fact. It's not necessarily my favorite as far as like films go, the action sequences and whatever else, but it is definitely the most important and profound because they presented a society, an African society, that was untouched by colonialism and untouched by enslavement. And I mean, that kind of a narrative is not something that we tend to see. Not only that, but they were advanced. And for someone like Stan Lee to create a character like this, I think in the 70s, where you have them with such like technological, intellectual and spiritual prowess within this kind of Marvel universe, I think was amazing and a great gift to like comic lovers and people that are really fascinated and in awe of this kind of film and these kind of narratives. So yeah, images like this really contributed a lot to, and the stories like this contributed a lot to wanting to create a piece like Kumbi Saleh 3020 CE. And it helped me to really envision what the society would look like. And of course, when you regard the sculpture, these kind of small details don't always become apparent. You know, you're looking at Lego clustered together in what is recognizable as like a city, but the small details and like the spirit of the city that I created is not necessarily there to be seen. It lives in the hearts and in the minds of those that perceive the sculpture, and it allows you at least the space to sit with the idea that in 1,000 years there is going to be this advanced and peaceful African society within a city called Ghana. I'm not even sure. Is there some kind of like reaching back to the past? Like, what would the continent look like in 1,000 years? Will it be the fact that this isn't even situated in the same place as present-day Ghana? Perhaps not. You know, maybe it goes back to a place where such rigid lines of nationality aren't drawn. But at some point in that future, someone reached back and said, okay, I remember that there was this city called Kumbi Saleh that existed, it must have been 1,000 years in the future from now, it'd be 2,000 years in the past for them. And to say that there was this city that was this hub and bustling center of trade, commerce, and spirituality that existed, and we're going to rename our city after the same city. So again, speaking to that tradition of reaching back into the past and pulling into the future, these things that matter so much. Which brings me to some of the works in my exhibition. So as you can all see, or have all seen, I'm sure, the images of the camel has become kind of like the flagship for this partnership with the museum for caravans of gold fragments in time and building black civilizations, and I couldn't be more appreciative of that. And I think like the camel captures, I think, so much of the essence of what both of these exhibitions are really trying to illuminate. And I'll just kind of briefly go over what I wrote about this sculpture and why I felt the camel particularly was really important. So the camel is arguably the most important component of the trans-Saharan trade. Caravans, past and even present, physically equipped to endure the harsh conditions of the desert, this resourceful animal made possible all the cross-cultural exchange that occurred from West Africa to as far as India, beginning around the 7th century BCE, and carries on to this day. Each camel in this artwork carries a unique architectural load, indicative of some of the places the caravans traveled, sometimes by the hundred. My inspiration came from the recognizable domes of Persian palaces to the clustered slum dwellings of Cairo and the bold and elegant minarets of prominent mosques across the Middle East. And as you can see with these sculptures, I did my best to really incorporate different characteristics into each camel, not just to the loads that they were carrying. Whereas you have the camel bringing up the rear that has its nose tilted up at a particular angle to indicate that they are of royalty. I suppose it's that angle, I'm not sure, 45 degrees, that only monarchs can achieve. And the second camel was really important to create a camel that indicated the kind of burden, because I mean these are beasts of burden, right? And despite how important they are to us, sometimes there was like a certain kind of empathy I felt for the camel at that point. You know, they're really important. They've done so much to help us and help the world. But at the end of the day, I mean, I wonder how many camels died from their experiences and having to carry so much gold and, you know, just, they're definitely resourceful, but how resourceful could they be? So it was important that I showed one that just was perhaps in need of rest, but there was no respite ahead for this animal. It had to keep going. And that also reminded me of the experiences of those that are most vulnerable in society and those that experience poverty to extremes that a lot of us don't often really encounter. And that's why it was important that for this particular camel, it was carrying the load of these people and trying to really extend a bit of empathy for them. And then, of course, there's the first camel, which there's something really intrepid about it. And I think just because the movement of Islam into Africa at that time was really important. And I remember in some of the research that I was doing, the desert could be a perilous place, and Islamic law coming in actually helped to reduce crime and made it a bit more of a safe journey across the desert. So I thought it was really important to show that the strides that were taken and the importance of Islam moving into the continent. Yes. Okay, so I think of all the pieces, with the exception of Kubi Saleh, which I suppose is my favorite just because, I mean, I like working in scale because it's the most challenging. I like to bleed for my art, which I did for Kubi Saleh. I had to end up wearing a brace because when you're building, so often I'll build figurative artworks, and there's a lot of small details that are being built with them. But also there's usually an armature that gets built. So I'll have a steel armature constructed, which is acts as like a skeleton for figurative work. And then I'm building around it, going up with gravity. So despite the fact that there's a lot of pressing, it's a different kind of pressure that gets inflicted on my hands when I'm going up this way and clicking things this way, in opposed to pushing down and having to click a lot with my thumbs going like this. And with Kumbi Saleh, there was a lot of that going on. If you see like the mountainous regions around it, so it was just constant pressure on my thumbs, so my thumbs started to hurt. And then sometimes like on the edges, Lego can be very, very sharp. Don't kid yourselves, it's dangerous, okay? I know it seems relatively innocuous when it's all boxed up in Toys R Us, but it's dangerous. Be careful. Sometimes if I'm putting too much pressure and my hand slips and I go graze it across like a square piece, get scratched. And so I definitely drew blood. It happens from time to time. But such is the artist's life. So yeah, aside from Kumbi Saleh, this piece I think is my favorite. And it's my favorite not just because like aesthetically I love it and I got to create like figurative forms on a smaller scale and kind of bring in architectural forms and merge like the architectural aspects. If you can see, there's always, that's the thing with this exhibit, I always manage to find some way to pull architecture in some way into the sculptures. So I got to bring in like these small little dwellings on the rock surfaces that these monuments are affixed to. So I love it for that reason, but a lot of the reason is because of the story. And if you remember when I first started talking about like civilizations, it's really about these stories that are endearing. And I remember even Michael saying that it brought there's a human aspect, not just to this work, I mean to the exhibit, but for this particular work, I think that's where it stands out the most. One, because they're actually taking the form of humans, but because of the story, and I think it's something that we can all find like endearing. So the legend tells of a figure known alternately as the desert fox, the dune surfer, and more accurately, the bandit queen of WALATAH. As a young girl, she narrowly escaped the cruelty and abuse of the slave caravan, only to be left for dead in the unforgiving Akor Bazin. But the girl did not die. Blessed with cleverness and an unnatural strength by the moon goddess Maulisa, she grew up and forged an indomitable will of virtue and vengeance, vowing to save all girls from slavery and make the rich slave merchants of the oasis pay for their avarice and unconscionable trade. Over the years, the bandit queen amassed a fierce tribe of freed women warriors, 100 strong. Flanked at all times by her twin daughters, the generals Princess Aisha and Princess Ezi, their raids were widely feared across the land. Despite the reputation of terror the bandit queen fostered until her death, the tribe only ever kept for themselves what was needed, giving away the majority of their plundered goods to the poor, hungry, and oppressed. And I think, like when I was writing this story, I remember when I was young, there was a Disney cartoon of Robin Hood, and it was anthropomorphized. So Robin Hood was a fox, and they had all the different animal characters. The Sheriff of Nottingham was a wolf. I don't know. That was a cartoon I really enjoyed when I was young, and I think the idea of Robin Hood, this rogue that goes around, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, was also a great story. And I felt the need to create something similar to that. And also, it makes me reflect that there's been so many stories that have been stolen and changed over time that we don't know where the actual roots of these stories come from. So it made me think, well, maybe Robin Hood, happening in that medieval period didn't exactly come from someone just thinking it up. Maybe he took a trip somewhere and caught wind of a story from somewhere else of an actual character, and as often happens, decided to paint a white face on it and say, well, this is what happened. I don't know. So if there's any real archivist, Robin Hood enthusiasts in the crowd that are going to say, he didn't, he wrote it, it's true. I'm a descendant of Robin Hood. I apologize. I'm not saying it actually happened. I'm just saying it's a possibility. And that nonetheless, the story really inspired me. And I wanted to tell a similar story that could have happened somewhere along these trade routes in the wilds of the desert. And also to bring light to the fact that, when we talk about enslavement, often the slave trade that occurred transatlantic is so focused on what happened in America, perhaps because the American slave trade was just so brutal, and perhaps America, right? They're just everything is always everywhere. But in fact, like what was happening in South America was just as large and just as problematic and harsh, and on the different islands in the sugarcane trade. But also like the enslavement of Africans and by the Arab world lasted even longer. And it's not often talked about like how much racism exists in that cultural context. So it was important to also create a character that was liberating people from that particular period of enslavement. Building a utopia, Kingdom of Ghana 1,000 years in the future. So this is the picture I took in my studio the day I finished Kumbisale, which was basically 6 hours before the museum movers came to pick it up and bring it to the museum. So, I mean, time is always of the essence when I'm building, and this was definitely not an exception. I was building furiously for this piece. I just finished, like, coming back from overseas for another exhibit, and then I had to jump right into this and build this sculpture. It was the first time I'd built a large-scale architectural piece, and I mean, it was, I think, despite the pains and things that I talked about, and like just the trials that I go through when building, which often comes down to like ordering parts and having to wait to get my parts. So just to answer any pre-questions about where I get my Lego, I order from a website called Bricklink. It's started off, I guess, as like a hobbyist site. You know, it's not directly affiliated with Lego in any way, but there are thousands of people in the world that I don't know exactly how they got so much Lego, but they have it in hordes, and some of them, they must have it in like warehouses or own a couple properties that are just completely filled with storage bins, because when I'm ordering, sometimes I'll go on there and want some circular piece to make for like the roof of a building or something. And I find that there's someone in like Belgium that has 60,000 of this one piece. I'm like, why on earth do you have 60,000 of this random circular piece? Like where and why? I have quite a bit of Lego, and if any of you were to see my studio, I'm sure it might be the most Lego you may have seen outside of like the Legoland theme parks or whatever the case. But it is nothing compared to the amount of Lego that some of these people have. So anyway, some of the trials I experience is just like, because I don't know what I'm going to use when I build it, it's a very fluid process. So as I'm building, I don't know. I'll build something and then I say, oh, you know what? I like the way this looks. Now let's see how many of these I have. Okay, I have only 4 of them. And I probably need about, 500. So then mid-build, when I'm in the process of building this one particular quadrant and I'm like, this is the art district of Kumbisale and this is what's going to happen here, I have to pause that, order parts, wait for the parts to get here, which sometimes can be 3 days, sometimes can be weeks. And then that kind of throws things off kilter. So I would have to then change the process in a way or move on to another section. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, the building process is rife with all kinds of different challenges that I guess are not just limited to like the creative or imaginative component of working, but literally to the material. And let's not even get into how expensive it is. Because, as I'm sure you all know, when trying to buy a Star Wars kit for some of your children, it's like ridiculously expensive. So, yeah, it's a quite labor-intensive process to build. And this part right here on the central spire is an Adinkra symbol. So Adinkra is it's like a set of symbols developed by the Akan people in West Africa, and largely used in Ghana. And you'll see it adorned on various things, cultural items, clothing, fabric, everywhere. I think even there's a car, a Ghanaian car that's being developed, and a Adinkra symbol is, I think, the symbol that they're using, which I think is amazing to me, because when I look at like some of the logos and insignias of different car companies, some swishy lines or whatever, I don't know, they don't mean that much to me. But when I think about a car that would have an Adinkra symbol as their insignia, that to me, I don't know, it speaks volumes. So I thought it was really important. One of the journalists that was doing a story on this piece before, I think I had mentioned the word utopia somewhere here and there, but it really didn't like fully come into my mind that what I was building was like a utopia. I guess in my mind it was always existed that it wasn't going to be a dystopia, like I wasn't going to build this place that was like rife with, warfare and conflict. But it hadn't really sat in with me that what I was building was this, magical realm that was about prosperity and life fulfillment and enjoyment, and despite the fact that likely there was some kind of monarchy, or it wasn't, I felt it was important that the symbol that would be on the center spire would be something that united people. And this symbol particularly is called Jin Wanyi, which means the pursuit of happiness, enjoyment of life. And I thought that there was no better symbol to kind of encapsulate what a utopia would be. And if I was living in this city, or any of you were living in this city, looking up to that symbol every day as the sun rises, I think would definitely give us like reason to keep going, even when, despite living in a utopia, I really feel like as far as humans go, nothing could be like absolutely utopic, right? There's always going to be some stress or distress or discontent. But if you're looking up to a symbol, and everybody from that cultural context understands that symbol means to enjoy your life and to pursue happiness and whatever that means, then I think that would definitely give us all the feeling that, life is worth living and the pursuit of happiness is important above all things. So just to show you a couple of images from like the inception of the sculpture, I started looking into different city building techniques for the future, and it seems like circular cities are something that architects have been thinking about. I'm not sure exactly how long this has been like a concept. It's certainly existed in past societies, thousands of years old. They're been discovered where the actual geography, design of these cities and places of residence are circular. And something about circles, I don't know, just touches me in a very particular way. Also, I think in terms of efficiency, having like a circular city, and I think it increases mobility. Whereas everything is equidistant, like all the sections are equidistant from the center. So yeah, I thought when I was first developing it, I knew that it was going to be some form of like circle. And when you're working on a large scale with Lego, I can tell you it is difficult to make a perfect circle. So mine is more oblong than perfectly circular. I thought it was going to be perfectly circular, and then I remember at one point I was building along and everything was kind of laid out to the point of no return, and I counted the studs one way and counted the studs the other way, and it was off by like 2 studs. I was crying that night, but I got over it. And just like a little bit more development of the sculpture. I didn't know that the major mode of transportation for this sculptural city was going to be water and using water vessels. That came about later. In fact, with the blueprint drawing that I think is still on a time-lapse video somewhere in the museum, I think on the top floor, you can see, if you look really closely, it doesn't necessarily seem like you don't see the waterways and vessels, because I guess it would be really small detail. But when I was drawing it, I'll tell you the truth, I wasn't thinking of like drawing these kind of waterways. But it just became something that I guess made sense. Also, I got to utilize a particular kind of Lego piece, which is translucent black. And that was great because I'm pretty adamant about building in black solely. Like I do use other colors sometimes for different purposes. I have a commission for the Toronto Zoo coming up where I'm building an eel. And I mean, that one's not going to be in black, and I've done things in the past. But for my body of work building black, obviously, it's important that I stick to black. But I wanted to find some more nuance to it, and I discovered, I always knew this piece, this palette existed, the translucent black, but I hadn't really thought about it as black. And then I'm like, well, it's translucent black, so it's still black. I gave myself a little leeway to use it, and it worked out beautifully because the way that light transfers like through it, and it kind of offsets the opaqueness of the black that I was using for the rest of the sculpture. So I really enjoyed using that. And I also didn't know that there were going to be these like ancestral faces carved out of the stone for the sculpture. I didn't know that this was going to be the main entrance either. Originally, I had the side part where there's these side gates were going to be the entrance point to the city. But then I don't know. I thought about something I saw in the Lord of the Rings, where they're on this boat, this little canoe, and they're traveling down this water path, and then they come across these two giant sculptures of like the kings of old, as Aragorn said, the kings of old, and they had their hands out, and they're massive sculptures. And I mean, I remember when Lord of the Rings came out, I was psyched. I was so excited for that film. Even to this day, I still love the way that it was done. So despite the fact that my interest lies in Black identity and exploring these kind of landscapes and Afro-diasporic landscapes, I can't deny that, of course, like my inspiration comes from all over the place. And when I thought about that, I thought it was amazing. And of course, I'm just like, but I'm not going to do it like y'all did it. I'm going to do it my way. And my way reflects on a lot of the different African masks that I had in my household growing up, and that I would see at my aunties' and uncles' places when I went there. It was a consistent theme, seeing these pieces. So when it came time to like carve something out, I thought about doing something kind of like the Bandit Queen of WALATAH, where I made like a small scale, like human form that would indicate, if you look at the scale of the city, a large scale human form carved into the rock. But then I thought, no, that's probably not what would be there. It would likely be, if I was to really be true to myself, I thought about like some kind of like futuristic, but at the same time archaic African city. It would probably have a mask face carved into the wall rather than like a full form. Maybe, I mean, who's to say, but something about that spoke to me, so I decided to create these faces. And then once I made the faces, I knew that this was going to be the main entry point for the city. And then as I developed it, I made sure that the water runs straight through the city. So if you go back and you look at the sculpture, you can look right from the front all the way down, straight through the sculpture to the back. And it was important for me to use these Lego parts that have holes in them on the top surface part, so that light would be able to transfer through, and that spectators would be able to get down and look straight through it. I mean, it does get pretty dim, because a lot of the light is blocked out, but not as completely as I've done with past sculptures. And again, that comes from just kind of this process of discovery, of learning about new parts that I don't normally think about when I'm building. Like I've seen those parts before that have this kind of cross-hatching holes through the Lego part, but I never really thought about them being incorporated into any of the work that I was doing until it came time to want to really have light pass through some of my work. And in this particular situation, it worked out really well. And then, a couple more pictures of me building it and going through the motions of developing everything and putting all these things in place. And again, I mean, despite the drawing, when it came to actually building these small dwellings and buildings, I didn't really think about, I didn't have a plan for it. It's just as I built, something that I guess is a recurring theme, which is that Lego informs the art, and it often does. You know, there's clearly a part inside me, in the creative process that I put into it, but it's without a fail dictated by the material. What do I have on hand? What can I find? And what can I repurpose? And these things kind of come out, and there's a certain kind of enjoyment that comes from building something like this, because I'm just thinking about, if I was living there, what would be happening. Even creating the little vessels, like here, tiny little pieces, and to get on such a small scale wasn't exactly easy. I think if you're familiar with the little Lego characters, they're called minifigures or minifigs. And when you start getting that small, you have to start finding parts that don't click in the same way that we're all familiar with Lego clicking, which is with the stud and then the recessed part that clicks on the stud. For these tiny pieces, they don't click in that exact way. There's a smaller unit of adhesion that Lego creates, which for this case was if you picture the small minifigure character, they have I think it was a Star Wars set, they have some kind of shoulder armor, and then on the shoulder of a minifig, there's like a little weapon that sits and clicks in with like a tiny little pinhole part. And I really hadn't paid attention to that before until I realized that underneath some of the Lego pieces, if you flip it around, the center hole is like a donut shape on some of the pieces. So it's not just a complete like cavity circular hole, but it's a little thicker and has like a tiny little pinhole in it. And then I realized that this tiny weapon piece, if you turn the piece upside down, can stick into it. And then that's how I developed these things. And then when you put that against this translucent black Lego area that is clearly defined as like a water system, and then you have this tiny little weapon that is placed on it, when you look at it, you don't see a weapon, you see like some kind of vessel moving along on a waterway. Vessels that I call hover ships, because I just want to be all futuristic when I talk about them. I mean, if someone was to call it a boat, I'd say it's a hover ship. It's not a boat. In the future, we don't call them boats. Yeah, and then there's like, I think this is just before like the penultimate stage, before I finished it up. This might have been a couple days just before I had to turn it in, because the last bunch of days I wasn't sleeping much. As my wife tells me, whenever I have a large scale piece due, for the last 3 days before it's due, I just can't sleep. I have like anxiety and I just try to lie down, I can't sleep. So literally I was on no sleep for like 3 days when I was doing it. I remember I had to drive up to Barrie to pick up some parts. I was so thankful because I really needed these parts to be able to finish it the way I needed. And this one seller happened to have tons of this particular part. So I had to drive up to Barrie and pick up the parts, drive back to the studio, and then like wrap it all up. And I'd say it turned out pretty well. Yeah, so, I mean, as far as like Lego goes, it's a globally iconic medium, or like toy, I guess you can say. But I also feel like there's a part about Lego that's really unprovocative. You know, it's simple, it's colorful, but yeah, there's nothing really like provocative about it. And so there's something like culturally polarizing about using black Lego to illustrate like African history and to navigate the realm of black imagination and narrative. And I mean, that's the sea I swim in, so I'm really, really, really glad that things have worked out in the way that it has, and I'll likely be continuing to do what I'm doing. I'll be going back to Korea in the spring. I just found out yesterday, which is great. There's a place there that's dedicated to artworks made with Lego and different kinds of like brick configurations, and they wanted to acquire a piece of mine for some time, so back to Jeju Island. Have you ever been to Jeju Island, any of you? South Korea? It's beautiful. It's a paradise. So anyway, yeah, I'm really happy that things have been going really well for my career, and I thank you all so much for coming out. So I will end it there and open up the floor for any questions that you may have.